Hello everyone and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'm going to be going over Chapter 2 and 3 of Why is Deku So Good with Kids, picking up for Part 2 of this series. I'm really excited to get back into this one. I really love the dynamic between Izuku and Eri. I really like how Aizawa's just trying to understand what the heck is going on. Because of the shortness of Chapter 2, I decided to make this second part 2 chapters, so it'll be Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 today. Please let me know any thoughts or reactions you guys have to this, and as always, looking forward to any comments you have with any recommendations for other fics you'd like to hear. Alright, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So this is Chapter 2, starting first, in which Eri loves Deku. So, Eri, Shota started slowly. The two of them were walking back to the teacher's dorm, side by side, Arie looking around her carefully, trying to catch every detail of the outside world. Shota had given up on trying to figure out Midoriya's trauma, at least for now. He couldn't save Midoriya right now, not when Midoriya was hiding, but he could help Arie. She was right in front of him. He could help save this girl. Her eyes flickered up to curiously meet him, and Shota wished he had Midoriya's observational skills, because what did that face mean? "Are you having a good day?" he asked. Midoriya had said to start with questions. Arie nodded, face thoughtful. "Yes, I like watching the green sparks." Well, that was interesting. "You mean when Deku-kun uses his quirk?" She nodded again. So Arie liked watching Midoriya fighting. That was interesting. Shota wondered if Midoriya knew that. Suddenly he felt an urge to learn something from Arie, anything that Midoriya wouldn't know. There had to be something that would make Shota feel just one step of his annoyingly empathetic problem child. Even just beating the stupid 5 minutes he'd gotten her to talk earlier would feel like a nice step for him. "You like Deku-kun?" Her eyes lit up. "Very much, yes." Spying his opportunity in Arie's bright expression, and the way she was wiggling her butt a little just like Midoriya said she would, his problem child was annoyingly accurate sometimes. Shota pressed on. "What do you like about him?" A smile split across her face. "Oh, so many things," she said, and then she started to talk, and talk, and talk. Shota was immediately overwhelmed as she began, words rushing out of her mouth, leaving nothing behind, mentioning everything she'd ever loved about Midoriya, anything she'd ever noticed. As she continued on, Shota began to realize that there was a lot about Midoriya that even he, the boy's teacher, hadn't noticed. He learned from Arie that Midoriya rarely talked about his scars. And there were many scars, apparently, even old ones from before UA. He would look pensive when he looked at him, like there was something there that hurt him, except for the ones on his right arm, which made him look determined and strong. It reminded Arie of her own scars, which she brandished out in front of her as they walked, something Shota had never seen her do before. Shota learned that Midoriya had a very nice mother, whom Arie had seen talk with Midoriya over the phone once, but he never talked about his dad, and his expression would go bad, as Arie put it, whenever he thought about him. He loved his mom very much and liked to talk to her or about her, give her snippets of things that she'd said, little bits of advice. It made Midoriya happy to talk about his mother. His expression would brighten up and he could talk for a long time. Arie said that Midoriya didn't like to go into the woods by himself, and that Midoriya would often fall silent, staring blankly at a blank wall, expression in a dark place. Apparently this happened most often when Bakugo, who Arie called the spiky mean person, was having an especially angry day. Sometimes Midoriya would completely freeze up at the sound of loud popping or the smell of fire, and Arie wouldn't be able to snap him out of it. Arie didn't understand why Midoriya would do that, but Shota did. Oh, he did. And how hadn't he noticed that before? Why on earth had he decided to sit Midoriya next to Bakugo in class? How many times had he seen Midoriya flinch away from Bakugo's hands? Midoriya apparently had nightmares just as often as Arie did, and when he had nightmares he didn't do blah blah blah. He just curled up in his room and buried his face in his knees. Arie didn't think that was a good way to deal with nightmares because it didn't give them any place to go. Shota silently agreed. There were so many things. Midoriya muttered sometimes, but only when he was excited about something. Midoriya could write really fast, a full page before 2 minutes ran out. Midoriya loved All Might, but he sometimes got nervous or jittery around him. Midoriya was very good at drawing. Midoriya hated lies, which was hard because, according to Arie, he had many things he was hiding, and she didn't know what they all were. That one gave Shota pause. What did Midoriya have to hide? As long as Shota had known him, he'd pretty much been an open book, only with a few things making his walls come up. So the knowledge that he had something he was hiding and lying about, and that Arie had been the one to pick up on it, was a little unsettling, to say the least. Arie continued on, talking about everything she could think of relating to Midoriya, regardless of whether or not Shota was listening. Midoriya sometimes felt hurt in his right wrist and would close his eyes and breathe slowly in order to ignore the feeling. Midoriya didn't like it when Arie was sad. Midoriya got a warm face when he looked at Uraraka. Midoriya looked sad sometimes around Todoroki, and he often fell into quiet while looking at Todoroki's scar. Midoriya really liked Katsudan, and he didn't particularly like chocolate, which Arie couldn't understand because she personally liked chocolate very much. Midoriya felt lonely, even though he had many friends, and he had trouble believing that people liked him. Midoriya didn't have his quirk manifest for a very long time, and he was lonely for a while because of it. Shota made a mental note to look this up in Midoriya's records later. Midoriya didn't like adults. Deku doesn't what? Shota interrupted sharply, forgetting his early determination to get her to talk for 5 minutes uninterrupted. Arie frowned at being cut off, eyes dropping to her feet. Deku doesn't like adults, she repeated quietly. Shota was baffled by that. Why? Her frown deepened, her head tipping slightly to the side. They remind him of dark things, she said slowly. What dark things? Shota asked himself. Frowning through his curtain of hair at the path in front of them, he was more than a little frustrated. Arie somehow knew just as much about Midoriya as Midoriya knew about her. It was frustrating because they didn't spend nearly as much time together as Shota did with either of them, but somehow they'd managed to get to know each other 1,000,000 times better than he did in 1/8 of the amount of time he'd had. They make him nervous, Arie said, interrupting Shota's thoughts. Adults? Some of them, yes. She paused, thinking. Evidently, she could tell that Shota really wanted to know why. He thinks they'll hurt him? She cocks her head, throwing that out. No, she tried again, words coming out slowly. He can't trust them. The word was out of his mouth before Shota could stop it. Why? Well, of course Arie doesn't know why, he reprimanded himself the moment the word escaped, because, honestly, how could she know? It wasn't like Midoriya was spilling his life trauma. Everything she'd said was really just her reading far into Midoriya's actions and words. He hadn't told her he didn't like the woods, which was why she was wrong about that one. Midoriya didn't mind being in the woods alone. Actually, he found it relaxing, especially when he was on a run. What Midoriya didn't like was the woods at night, but of course Arie wouldn't know that, to be honest. Shota was starting to be surprised that he knew that. Midoriya was smart. Shota knew that maybe better than anyone. The kid had a sharp mind, a fantastic way of picking up on tiny details, and that came with an understanding that people shouldn't share their life trauma stories with kids. Midoriya knew that. He wouldn't just straight up tell Arie why he didn't like adults. It was to Shota's immense surprise, then, when Arie actually deeply contemplated the question, and to his even greater surprise that she answered. He thinks they'll not do things. Of course, her answer didn't make any sense. Shota didn't feel like pressing her for more, but she gave it willingly after a few more seconds of thought. He thinks they'll not notice him hurting. She tipped her head further to the side, corner of her lips turning down. And he's right, they don't. Shota suddenly came to the realization that he was in way over his head. Arie kept talking, and Shota listened, clinging to her every word like a lifeline. He holds his right wrist, and they don't notice or ask him if he's okay, she said softly, eyes flashing with something that almost looked protective. He has nightmares, and they don't know. He doesn't like it when they touch his shoulders, but they do it anyway. He flinches from the spiky mean person's voice, and they don't notice. Well, that hurt. Shota knew that he hadn't meant to be picking on him in particular, but he was an adult, and therefore he was the one who messed all that up. He did wonder what this whole shoulder-touching thing was, and a memory flashed through his head of Midoriya straight up jumping from his seat when Ashido nudged the top of his shoulder once, panic flashing through his eyes. Shota had dismissed the incident as Midoriya's natural jumpiness, but now, well, Shota was starting to think that maybe he wasn't even that great with teenagers. He is afraid he will not be good enough, and no one tells him he already is, Arie finished, sounding very determined. reaching unprecedented levels of compassion and maturity. "But that's why Eri-chan is here," she said, turning her whole face to meet Shota's eyes. Her small jaw was set, her mouth tightened into a defensive line. Shota didn't think he'd ever seen her red eyes look so sharp or protective before. She looked like someone who wouldn't back down from a fight. Because Deku has bad days sometimes," Arie said forcefully, "and no one notices but me." Shota could have cried at that. He lifted a hand to press his fingers to his eyelids. "Deku has bad days sometimes, and no one notices it but me." That was true. No one did notice. No one except maybe Uraraka or Todoroki, and they were busy enough as it was. In hindsight, Shota could remember what it looked like when Deku had a bad day. He tended to fidget more, to stare off into space, and every time he got into something wrong, he would retreat further and further into his shell. Something in Bakugo always seemed unbearable in those days, and the sound of his voice would make Midoriya's hands shake so hard he tucked them under his legs in the desk, biting hard on his lip. "And I will make Deku-kun feel happy," Arie said, the determined tone dropping to be replaced with softness, bordering on love. Certainly the closest Shota had ever heard her get to love. "And why?" he asked her, wondering genuinely what it was that made her want to protect Midoriya so much. Not why she wanted to protect people. That was easy enough for him to understand, with all his experience with heroes. But why was she wanting to protect Midoriya specifically? Sure, Midoriya was nice and a little self-sacrificial at times, but wasn't that it? What did Arie see in him that made her almost love him? She doesn't even think before she answers. "Because he is so very good, and he doesn't believe it when I tell him it's true." And Shota felt his heart almost break. And that concludes Chapter 2. We're going to move right along to Chapter 3, titled "In Which Midoriya is a Calming Presence." Shota and Arie were almost back to the teachers' dormitories, both of them lapsing into silence when it happened. Well, he wasn't entirely sure what happened, but one second Arie was fine, and the next second she was completely losing it. Losing it, of course, was a relative term. For Arie, losing it usually meant that she started trying desperately to make excuses and apologizing for something she'd done that she thought she'd get in trouble for. Shota knew exactly how to handle it when that happened. He'd done it before, but this was not that. All he knew was one moment Arie had been peacefully walking beside him, looking interestedly all around her, and the next second Arie had frozen in place, eyes fixed on a certain spot in the distance. He turned to her in confusion, unsure about what was happening. She was frozen, breaths gradually speeding up until they were coming in short gasps, that Shota wasn't sure that she was actually getting any air into her system at all. He leaned down over her, opening his mouth to ask if she was okay, eyes skimming the ground to see what had triggered it, when her entire body went limp. Shota managed to catch her just before she slumped fully to the ground, and she fell into his arms, eyes squeezed shut now, taking tiny little breaths. She flinched away from his touch, trembling body tensing slightly in his arms. "Eri-chan?" Shota asked hesitantly. There was no response from Arie, just the continuation of her short breaths. A bead of sweat appeared on her forehead, and Shota instinctively reached out and brushed it away. Arie's entire body gave a shudder as he touched her, and then she froze up again, biting her lower lip so hard that Shota thought she might draw blood. "Arie, I need you to breathe," he said softly, trying not to pressure her. It didn't work. She dutifully took a breath, but it looked forced, and releasing it had no effect on her physique. The tension stayed in her shoulders, and her face stayed screwed up away from him. Shota got the sickening feeling that Arie was only breathing because he told her to, and she was afraid of getting in trouble if she didn't. Not for the first time today, Shota realized he had no idea what to do. For the first time ever, it seemed she was afraid of him, not of what he might do. There was a difference. Almost immediately, he realized that whatever this was, he was not the best person to deal with it. In fact, he realized suddenly none of the adults at school would be helpful in this situation. He lifted Arie up, wincing as she went limp in his arms, entire body quivering. Unfortunately, he had to move her. They couldn't just be in the middle of the path. He put her down on a park bench and took a few steps away, trying to give her space as he swallowed his pride and pulled out his phone. Before he gave himself time to second-guess his decision, he pressed on Midoriya's contact and waited for the tone to ring, trying to watch Arie's condition from a distance. As much as he hated it, Midoriya was probably the only person in the school right now that could get Arie back from whatever was happening. 2 rings later, Midoriya picked up, sounding marginally confused. "Aizawa-sensei?" "Midoriya," Shota said, glancing at Eri. It's... Something in his tone must have keyed Midoriya into the problem, because Shota was interrupted by a short, slightly panicky, "I'll be there in 2 minutes." And then the line went dead. Shota looked down at his phone, sighing slightly. Then he turned back to Arie, trying to figure out how to help her. She was taking short, tight breaths, hands clenched in her lap. Her entire body was quivering, but tense, and her little shoulders were so tight that they were nearing her ears. "Arie," Shota said softly. She didn't respond beyond the tension in her shoulders increasing a little, so nothing he could say to her would help her. "Just keep breathing," he told her resignedly. Being a hero, Shota had a lot of experience with panic attacks. He knew how to handle it when someone had one in front of him. He knew the proper steps to calm them down. But something else he had been taught by experience was just as important. If there's someone around who can do it better than you, get them. So he waited. To be fair, he didn't have to wait long, though. Midoriya showed up faster than probably should be humanly possible, green eyes flashing with the amount of power running through them. "Had to use 15%, he explained, as he dropped full cowling and looked at Arie. His face set in caring determination, and he walked a few steps closer, crouching down in front of her. "Arie-chan," he called out quietly. She flinched away from the sound of his voice, but her eyes opened and she looked at his face. She wasn't quite making eye contact. Her view ended up somewhere near Midoriya's chin, but it was a step. Shota hovered nearby, watching them anxiously. They looked at each other for a long time, Midoriya's eyes darting up and down Arie's face, sometimes going down to her shoulders or her hands. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Her eyes squeezed shut again, and a shudder ran through her small frame. Midoriya shifted around until he was sitting on his butt on the ground, feet crossed in front of him. "Sorry," he muttered. She opened her eyes the teeniest bit, looking carefully at him from under her lashes. "Can you breathe all right?" he asked her. No response, just a continuation of the shaking and the short, raspy breaths. Midoriya pressed on, gentler than usual. "Let's breathe together, okay?" He held out a hand in front of him and moved it up slowly, up and down. Shota could see Arie's eyes tracking it from under her lashes. "In," Midoriya said, lifting his hand up. "And out," he finished, his hand dropping down again. Arie took half of a breath. It was jagged, but it was still there. And on the next in and out from Midoriya, some of the tension started to release from her shoulders. "Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Midoriya murmured after 15 full breaths. Arie was starting to look more relaxed, eyes still tracking his hand. The shivering had almost completely left, and she was breathing normally. "My head hurts," she said after a moment of consideration. "The ground is all tippy, and I am very, very afraid." Midoriya nodded, taking that all in stock. "My hands are pricking," Arie added, struggling with words. Shota understood what she meant. In these situations, sometimes people's hands tingled, adding to their panic. "Can you flex them for me?" Midoriya asked, demonstrating with his hands. Her little hands worked themselves open and shut a few times. "Does that feel better?" Arie nodded, breath catching a little in her throat. The panicked expression came back almost immediately. Shota twitched forward, his instinct to help temporarily overriding his trust in Midoriya's capabilities. But Midoriya had already started helping her breathe again, and Shota relaxed back into his old position. "Are you mad at me?" Arie asked, after a moment, clenching her hands into little balls in her lap. Shota tensed, and he could see Midoriya doing the same, although Midoriya was doing a much better job of hiding it than he was. "No, Arie-chan," Midoriya muttered. "I'm never mad at you." "But I'm taking up all your time and making things so much harder for you," she said, eyes brimming with coming tears. A crease started to form between Midoriya's eyebrows. "I don't feel like that," he answered quietly. "I love spending time with you, and stuff like this happens to me too, so I understand." "But why, problem child?" Shota thought. "Why does it happen to you too?" They all fell silent, tears starting to spill out of Arie's eyes. "I am very afraid," Arie said after 10 more breaths, in and out. Midoriya nodded, acknowledging her statement. "I think you're very brave," he told her, hands still swaying up and down to mimic breathing. Its rhythmic movements were almost hypnotizing, and Shota started to feel calming down himself with it. "It's hard to be afraid and listen to other people. You're doing really well. I'm so proud of you." "But only when I'm afraid?" Arie asked immediately. Shota winced. She had a sharp mind just like Midoriya. Maybe they didn't tell her they were proud of her enough. He could adjust for that, start giving her more encouragement. I'm proud of you all the time, but definitely also when you're afraid, Midoriya answered, letting Shota relax again. Honestly, it wasn't fair that Midoriya was so good at this. He could probably go into a job at therapy at this rate. Sometimes people forget to say they're proud of you until you really need them to say it the most. All the time, Arie echoed, eyelids drooping a little as she followed Midoriya's hands with her breath. She had to be exhausted. Things like this tended to be draining. But am I not afraid all the time? She asked, eyes flying open again. That hurt. Shota could physically feel that hurting in his soul. I would say lots of people are afraid all the time, Midoriya told her. And you being scared or nervous doesn't make me any less proud of you. I'm afraid a lot too, remember? And you handle being scared just as well as I do. Also, he continued, leaning forward and looking up into her eyes, you don't need to be afraid all the time, because I'm here now, and I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you. He reached out and placed one of his hands on her knees. She clutched at it with her quivering hands, pulling it closer. Arie took a shuddering breath, tears welling up in her eyes. But what happens when you're not here? She asked, voice trembling. If you get too close to me, you'll get hurt, Arie continued, voice falling to a whisper as her gaze dropped to their hands. Shota had to contain a sigh. He already tried to tell her multiple times that no one here was going to get hurt because of her. Midoriya said thoughtfully. I see what you're thinking. Well, there are lots of people around here that want to help you, Arie, not just me, and you can always rely on them. And, he frowned as he began to address her second point, I don't mind getting hurt for you, Arie. That's not exactly how Shota would have responded to that, and he almost wishes he could be taking notes. Shota would have immediately started protesting, trying to push the bad thoughts out of Arie, but Midoriya had simply acknowledged them and gently tucked them to the side. Arie's eyes flitted up and finally met Midoriya's. But I don't want you to get hurt, she protested. Well, why on earth would I get hurt? Midoriya asks, a little bit of a bolt and excitement poking into his soft tone. I'm invincible. A small smile crossed Arie's lips. No, you're not, she said. Says who? Aizawa-sensei, she answered, eyes flitting over to him. He says it when he has a Deku mutter moment and says how much you're always getting hurt. Midoriya and Arie both looked over at Shota, Midoriya looking amused and curious at the horrified expression crossing Shota's face. He didn't have Deku mutter moments. He wouldn't complain about a student out loud, especially not with an audience. But then Shota remembers how Arie is so good at keeping herself quiet and unnoticeable, and he starts to panic. Could he have forgotten she was there and muttered something to himself? What does he say? Midoriya says with interest, clearly noting the expression on Shota's face and trying to figure out how to push it further. Arie's voice lowered in a reasonable mimic of Shota's voice. Deku's arms are so covered in scars because he does not stop when he gets hurt. If one day passes where Deku doesn't get hurt, I will throw a party for... Midoriya's laughing cuts her off. At the sound of it, Shota blinks in surprise. He'd forgotten Midoriya's laugh. It was so light and fearless, and it felt like it almost had the ability to push away any dark thing in the room. How had he forgotten what it sounded like? When was the last time he'd even heard it? The others' laughs he could bring to mind easily. Bakugo's bark, Ashido's snicker, Tokiyami's rasp, Uraraka's bubbling giggle. But it had been ages since he'd last heard Midoriya's laugh. Shota supposed he was like Todoroki in that respect, and that neither of them laughed often, but Todoroki was just like that, and Midoriya, someone who had so much light and laughter inside him, should reasonably release it sometimes, so why didn't he? What was up with this kid? Did you really say that, Aizawa-sensei? Midoriya snickered, wiping his eyes a little. You'd throw a party? I thought you'd prefer death to partying. Shota scowled at him. I didn't say that exactly. Yes, you did, Arie said stubbornly, sending Midoriya into peals of laughter again. Arie was watching him laugh, the corners of her lips twisting up happily as he giggled, burying his face in his arm. She slid off the bench and laid a hand on his elbow, careful, Shota noticed, to avoid his shoulder or upper back. Thank you, Deku-kun, she said softly as he looked up into her eyes. I'm not afraid anymore. He beamed at her. I'm glad, Arie-chan. As Shota and Midoriya walked Arie back to the teacher's dorm, Arie fell asleep on Midoriya's back. Shota looked over, double-checking that she actually was asleep and not just relaxing, but her eyes were shut and her breathing was even, so he guessed it was as good of a time to talk as any. Why don't you like it when people touch your shoulders? Is this the first thing that came out? And Shota could have hit himself. Honestly, starting a conversation with what was looking more and more like a heavily traumatized teenager with that opening was just asking to get shut out. Midoriya's eyebrows furrowed together, and Shota found himself rushing to explain. Arie mentioned something about that. Shoulders visibly relaxing, Midoriya nodded. It's from when... He trailed off, clearly thinking hard about all the causes. Well, a couple of things, but the most recent is, remember when Shigaraki found me at the mall? Shota remembered it had been terrifying for everyone involved, and even people who just heard about it secondhand. One of the most dangerous people in the world had found his student and threatened to kill him, and had done it in one of the most public spaces available. If there was another way to laugh right in the face of the pro-heroes and the police force for being incompetent, that had to be it. Of course, Shota also remembered how amazingly well Midoriya had taken it, bouncing right back without even the slightest difference in his attitude. It sometimes felt like nothing had happened at all. Shota was now regretting not purposely getting the kid to talk out his feelings afterward, although he wasn't sure how Midoriya would handle a confrontation like that. He put his hand on my neck, Midoriya continued, tipping his head from side to side a few times in imagined discomfort. Arie shifted on his back, and he stopped the unnecessary movement. So really, if someone touched my neck, I would really have a lot of trouble, but the shoulders are a close second. That it kind of bugs me. Certain people it's okay with, especially if I know it's coming. Like who? Shota asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. Midoriya considered for a moment. All Might sometimes, Uraraka-san, or Arie, especially when I'm carrying her. My mom, but she never does it because it used to bug me as a little kid, too. Shota frowned at that. As a kid, would have been before the mall incident, so there had to be something else. Appearing to understand what he was thinking, Midoriya gave him a tight smile. And no, I'm not going to tell you about that. It's in the past, and I think it would get him in trouble. While Shota started wondering who the him was, and strongly suspecting it was Bakugo, Midoriya said, While we're talking about triggers, Arie doesn't like it when people hold her hand. Eyebrows shooting straight up, Shota said, Really? He could distinctly remember holding her hand on many occasions. She'd seemed fine with it at the time. Yeah, and she's good at hiding it when it's bugging her, so I have to really watch it. And also, Midoriya paused as though he's not sure he should be sharing this. Todoroki doesn't like it when people touch him at all, he said slowly. Except Arie, of course. Todoroki too, then? Shota wasn't sure. Shota wasn't so out of the loop that he couldn't tell that there was something up with Todoroki and Endeavor, but he had never really noticed that Todoroki didn't like being touched. Maybe that was just how cold and still Todoroki was all the time. Nothing ever really seemed to shake the kid. He supposed it was similar to Midoriya in a way, and that you could never really tell what either of them were truly thinking, but Todoroki hid his pain behind a wall of ice, and Midoriya hid his behind a ray of sunshine. Again, though, Shota had to be impressed that Midoriya had noticed. The other students never really seemed to think anything was wrong with Todoroki, besides the fact that sometimes he would sit in class and run one hand numbly over his scar, lost in thought. Midoriya was beginning to ramble now, going through all the little things he'd noticed that bugged the other students. Apparently, Uraraka didn't like talking about money or buying things. Ida had a sore spot around any discussions of paralysis. Mineta was afraid of especially tall women after his internship. Shota had no idea what that was about. Yaoyorozu froze up when people told her she was wrong about something. The list was long, and Shota was more than a little bit lost by the end of it, but Midoriya seemed perfectly confident, as though he was just commenting on the weather, rather than giving an in-depth analysis of every person's particular shutdowns. You really pay attention, don't you? Shota put in when Midoriya came up for air. Well, of course I do, Midoriya said cheerfully. I have enough triggers myself to know that you really shouldn't mess that up for other people, even by accident, and I like knowing things about people because it helps me help them. Shota was silently wondering about why exactly Midoriya had so many triggers. There were so many that he could have gotten from just villain attacks when they reached the teacher storms instead. I'll just carry Arie in then, Midoriya said hesitantly, stepping over the threshold and kicking off his shoes before starting to her room. Would you stay? Arie asked quietly from his back. Both of them turned to look at her, startled to see her awake. Stay, Midoriya echoed, a little bit bewildered. Until I fall asleep, Arie said, yawning, as Midoriya walked into her brightly lit room. But it's like 5 in the afternoon, he protested, glancing at the sun through the window. He set her down on the bed and crouched down in front of her so they could finish the conversation at eye level. And I'm tired, Arie argued back, glaring a little. I want to sleep now. Midoriya gave Shota a helpless look and nodded, smiling carefully at Arie. I would love to stay until you fall asleep, Arie-chan. Getting up, Midoriya pulled her curtains closed and helped tuck her into bed. Then, at her request, he curled up next to her in bed, one arm looped around her tiny frame, warming her with his sunshine. Even though Midoriya was clearly pleading with his eyes at Shota to please not leave him alone, probably panicked about not finishing his homework, Shota started backing out of the door. Chances were high that Midoriya was about to fall asleep, and based on the dark bags under his eyes, the kid needed it. Shota would be more than happy to exempt him from a few homework assignments so he could get some sleep. He shut the door, closing out Midoriya's gaze. Immediately, a scowl started to form on his face as he started to the front again in a fury. He needed to talk to one Bakugo Katsuki. So that concludes Chapter 3 of Why is Deku So Good with Kids. Really, again, I love this fic so much. There's 8 chapters on this one, so we're 3 chapters in already. Just a few more to go at this point. I'll continue with this as soon as possible, but I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I do. Please remember to just comment any suggestions you have, any feedback, things you like, things you don't like. That's all fine for me. And any fics that you guys want to recommend to hear, because I love feedback on that, and I also love discovering new fics to read myself. So if you've got any that you think are obscure, that people might not have heard of, go ahead and drop those below. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, guys.